During the Eastern Han times, in the minds of ordinary Chinese, the Buddha was a foreign god who had attained immortality, was capable of flight and transmutations, and helped people. So he was a helpful deity, a helpful foreign god. Because he was understood to have such attributes, the Buddha was put on the same footing as Chinese immortals, such as Si Wang Mu, and was incorporated into the ideas of immortality popular during the time, as well as absorbed into Chinese traditional funerary rites. There's a bit of irony there, the Buddha trying to put an end to all suffering and reincarnation and such, and him being incorporated into funerary practices. That's always been an irony of Chinese Buddhist arts. For the same reason, the Buddha was incorporated into various local cults and appears on objects of worships like money trees and these mirrors. Also for the same reason, the Buddha's legends and Buddhist symbols were taken as omens and became part of Shangri thinking, that is, of this communication from heaven, joining the major philosopher Dong Zhongshu's theory of the mandate of heaven. Because of the unsystematic nature of these indigenous cults, the themes of Buddhist arts were absorbed and used in a piecemeal manner, becoming isolated icons and symbols. So it's a Buddha-like figure rather than a Buddha. They do not appear in an inherently Buddhist context. So in the money tree, we're not talking about a Buddhist context, we're talking about the paradise of the Queen Mother of the West, we're talking about a money tree, about getting to the paradise of the Queen Mother of the West, and the Buddha, just a Buddha-like figure, happens to show up in that kind of general iconography, because that's how he's seen. He's seen as this kind of figure that fits into that scene. A well-known legend of events meant to have occurred in 64 of the Common Era. One night in the past, the Emperor Han Mingdi dreamed of a deity who had golden hues on his body and sunlight emanating from his neck, flying in front of the palace. This made the emperor ecstatic and pleased. The next day, the emperor asked his ministers, "Who was that person?" The learned Fu Yi answered, "I have heard that in India there is a person who has attained the Tao, called Buddha. He can easily rise and fly. He is most likely the deity you dreamed of." Upon hearing this, the emperor understood and immediately sent 12 people, including the envoy Jiang Qin, the court gentleman Qin Jing, and 10 erudite students, including the erudite student Wang Zhentuo of the Greater Yuezhi. They copied the sutra in 42 sections and placed it in 14 stone cases. The emperor established stupas and temples. Thus, the Dharma was widely spread, and Buddhist temples were set up everywhere. That's probably a legendary, it's a story that shows up in the histories, but probably mostly based on legend. But there's something interesting about that. Obviously, Buddhism was fairly well understood at court times at that time, because right off the cuff, this guy says, well, this was obviously the Buddha. So there were Buddhists, Buddhism was understood, or at least some aspects about the Buddha were understood in China before the year 64, before this story became common. The Greater Yuezhi's invasion of Bactria was an important event in the history of Chinese Buddhist transmission to China. It is highly possible that Buddhism was prevalent there in the late 1st century before the Common Era, that is, in the Kushan Empire, and that a Greater Yuezhi envoy to China at that time orally transmitted a Buddhist scripture to a Chinese student. So this is still during the Western Han. In the first years of the Yuanshou reign of the Han Emperor Aidi, so in the 2nd century before the Common Era, Jinglu, a student of the Grand Academy, received the direction of Futu Jing from Yizun, from an envoy sent to China by the king of the Greater Yuezhi. It was he who had reestablished Buddhism in China. The Futu Jing, said to have been translated in this period, might be a scripture describing the Buddha's life. So as early as the 2nd century, second year before the Common Era, there was a Buddhist sutra being translated into Chinese and was at least somewhat known. This comes from Xu Wenkan, and that's an article, if you can find it, it's well worth reading. It's an interesting kind of approach, because he's focused on the Yuezhi. So he brings that whole thing into a different kind of a focus. So that's another reason that Marilyn Rees says that can be and should be early, because of the first kinds of representations of the Buddha and some of the first scriptures from the Buddhist scriptures being transmitted and translated into Chinese were lives of the Buddha. And this does show the lives of the Buddha. So again, she's saying there was an iconography understood in China at this time, the life of the Buddha, that would make this piece, that would make sense for this piece to represent. So again, it's a very kind of interesting argument, and I do recommend that you go out. It's up one floor. I think it's still in that little case up there. It's still out of place. It should have been moved, if we want to believe this dating, and I become more and more convinced that it is. So the Greater Yuezhi established their Kushan Empire. This whole area up here is really interesting. The historical sources are Chinese, so we're always looking at it from the Chinese perspective. The actual history is being written at the time. Well, there's some literature at the time. It's in a vanished language, the Tocharian language, which is what Xu Wenkang works on. This is one of his areas of study, this Tocharian language. He argues that the Tocharians were Yuezhi. I know other people have other perspectives on that one. I'm not going to get into it because I don't know, but I think it's fascinating and it's really messy. There are some that argue that the Kushan Empire actually expanded way out over here. So if we look at that in terms of what we know of the Silk Road, well, the Silk Road goes, this is where you begin to cross the mountains here. They were coming right up to almost to Kucha, that major site on the northern Silk Road, which was a major Buddhist center. We know that, it was a very important Buddhist center. How Buddhism got there, I was told at the break there that, it's all about the monks, about the merchants and the relationship between the merchants and the monks. Well, there are people who argue that it was the Kushans, and they were pushing it there, that Kushans were both aggressive in terms of territory, but also they were spreading their religious beliefs. So that argument's going to go along, and I'm going to be finding myself on the wrong end of the argument sometime. But I think it's very interesting to think of this empire, the Kushan Empire, which was a Buddhist empire, who had a powerful king in Kanishka. That is historically known, that they made military adventures into this area. There are those that argue that they were able to capture and hold that territory for quite a period of time. Now, the Kushan Empire ended in the 3rd century of the Common Era. So those of you who are wondering about Gandhara and the kingdom of Gandhara, well, that's a little bit later, right? That's after the fall of the Kushan. That's between the Kushan Empire and the Gupta Empire. There were these small states as the political situation changed. But during its great power, the periods of great power in the 2nd century, the kind of second quarter and then the 3rd quarter of the 2nd century, the Kushan Empire was reaching way out here. So there are political and military reasons, there are mercantile reasons, there is the desire that any religion has, and certainly as part of Buddhism, to spread the religion. There were missionaries coming from all over the Buddhist world to Luoyang, the capital of the Eastern Han, and they had ghettos there. They set up their own environments, and they were spreading the faith. They were spreading Buddhism. So there was an active agent. So it isn't just the situation in China that brought about the advent of Buddhism. There were active agents bringing Buddhism to China, and I think that's very important to keep in mind. It wasn't just Chinese, okay, we're interested in finding a new religion, let's go find one. No, there were people who were bringing Buddhism to China, and they were doing real hard missionary work to do that. And that, I think, is a different way to look at this part of the history of Chinese Buddhism. So, Kanishka employed a policy of supporting and sponsoring various religions. Buddhism was able to adapt rapidly. So it changed, as Buddhism has changed. Okay, a little sideline here. Buddhism that was practiced in this time in China, or Buddhism as was practiced during the time of the Buddha, or shortly after, in the areas that he lived, is very different than the Buddhism that is practiced at the Zen Center out here in Green Gulch. Buddhism has proven to be a remarkably adaptable religion. That's one of the major things about Buddhism, is it adapts to its cultural environment quite readily, or seems to have adapted quite readily. So as it moves from place to place, Buddhism as a religion has been able, one, there have been people moving it and transmitting it and being missionaries, but also it has been able to adapt to the local cultural environment to become acceptable. And it did that in China. Buddhism changed. Pure Land Buddhism is, as practiced in China, Chan Buddhism as practiced in China was very different than Buddhism was practiced in India. So, and then when it went from China to Japan or China to Korea, it changed again into those local areas. It was an adaptable religion when it came to California, and people became Zen Buddhist practitioners in California. It changed to fit that marvelous period in the 70s, right, that we all went through, or some of us did anyway. All right, where was I? Got off on that. So, Yuezhi monks translated a great number of Buddhist scriptures into Chinese, most of which seem to have been Mahayana texts. They were active mercenaries. Missionaries, not mercenaries, missionaries. Most of the people who came from the western regions to China and adopted the Chinese surname Zhi, and that's one that you find in the histories quite often, during the 2nd to the 5th century were more or less related to the Yuezhi. One of them, Lokashima, Zhi Loqian, was the most famous Buddhist translator during the later Han period. He arrived at Luoyang between 178 and 179 of the Common Era and translated more than 10 Buddhist sutras from Central Asian languages into Chinese. The most noteworthy is the Prajnaparamita. Gosh, Jeff Durham, people who deal with these languages, I get about half the word out and I get stuck. These long terms. Anyway, the Prajnaparamita, which laid the foundations for the early development of Mahayana Buddhism in China. And then there are a number of very important members of the Yuezhi who came to China and translated texts, and they translated important texts throughout this period. So these people were coming as missionaries, they were coming in and serving as translators. The most eminent translator of the mid and late 3rd century was Dharmasaka Jufa Ha, whose ancestors had lived in Dunhuang for generations, but was also a Yuezhi. So he traveled to Kashmir. Kashmir, boy, if it wasn't such a political mess and dangerous place to go, it must be a fascinating, it was certainly a fascinating place then. It must be, I wonder what remains in the way of Buddhist materials there. So this guy, in the year 266, traveled from Dunhuang to Chang'an, Luoyang, crossed the Yangtze River. He translated 154 Hinayana and Mahayana sutras, covering almost all the important texts of of Buddhism, circulating in the Western regions. So as early as the later part of the 2nd century, about the 3rd century, there were a lot of Buddhist texts that had been translated into Chinese. And Luoyang was the great center for that translation activity. Buddhism became even more popular, and so Kucha, as we start moving then from that edge to Kucha, this is a fascinating area because almost all of these monks seem to have come from or spent some time in Kucha, the major monks that we know of. So they would go from Kucha, then they would go to Dunhuang, or they would go from Kucha and they would study in Kashmir, and they would end up in China. Kucha, it was a major city on the Silk Road, definitely supported by mercantile activities. It was, if you were looking at that area, some of the great sources of jade were right up here. There were a lot of things that were traveling in and out of that area. So it was a major trade center for goods going into China, jades and such, for goods coming out of China and moving along the Silk Road on into parts further west. So it was this huge kind of metropolitan area. The descriptions of the period in the 4th century, the number of Buddhist monks in that country reached, in that small country, they have Kucha, reached more than 10,000, with no less than 1,000 temples and stupas set up in the capital alone. 1,000 temples and stupas set up in the capital. So it was a major center of Buddhism, a major center of translation, a major center of transmission. So, and it was also a major merchant center, and obviously the merchants were providing a lot of the money that supported Buddhism and the Buddhist activities there. Okay, I think some of you have seen this before. This belongs to a local private collection. It came out of Dunhuang, It has an inscription on the end, which unfortunately has some problems. This inscription right here, which it gives a date of 247. That's very, very early for a work on paper. So I'm using a slightly controversial piece here to make a point. I actually believe that it's very early. I'm not sure that I believe the inscription. I can't be convinced one way or another, and scholars are going back and forth, and it's always fun. But this is a marvelous piece. And I'm mostly interested, the text is the Pajnaparamita Sutra. So that same text that had been translated during the Eastern Han. So the text did exist in Chinese at the time this was created. But the figure is fascinating. The figure shows, it's a Buddhist figure, you can see here. It's related in some ways to these things that you find along the Silk Road. This is from the Miran site, the Shanshan Temple. So these were active during what would have been in Chinese terms, Han times. But this is also in our piece, and Marilyn re-argues this is the earliest representation of the Avalokiteshvara, or Bodhisattva, in Chinese art. This one's not dated, but she argues that it's very early, giving it a late 4th to early 5th century date. You can see it had the same kind of structure, probably had the parasol through the tanks in the back. I want to use this as a discussion of how imagery was transmitted from the places further west into China. Because I know for years and years we all said, well, the monks came along with their little gilt bronze Buddhist sculptures in their pockets. And that's how Buddhist imagery got translated. And therefore it was always, okay, what was the exact Buddhist sculpture that the Chinese were copying? And everybody was trying to identify that exact Buddhist sculpture. I don't think that was the case. I think, as is always the situation when we look at art history and history and culture and such, the situation was much more complicated. I think a lot of Buddhist imagery got translated on pieces like this, things that were rolled up, much easier to carry than any kind of a bronze Buddhist sculpture. They also carried text with them, so they served a double purpose. So I think these pieces of paper or pieces of silk or whatever they were, flatworks, were being transmitted as well across the Silk Road. And the imagery that shows on them was one of the ways that Buddhist imagery got translated into China. Buddhist sculptures, obviously they did make it. Pieces did come. They're very rarely found in the Chinese context. Archaeological sites, I don't know of any Gandharan bronze Buddhist sculpture found in the Chinese archaeological context. This kind of thing is. So we have kind of a mixed series of things that were bringing imagery into China. Works on paper and so on, sculptures, and then word of mouth. So when we start looking at the exact representation of details on a Buddhist sculpture in China, we cannot expect them to fit to any given Indian model. I think the people who spend their time doing that, I think it's very interesting, trying to trace the direct, okay, where does the style of garment that's on the 3-3 Buddha? What exact source does it come from in India, in Gandhara, or wherever? I don't think you're ever going to find that, because I think it's an amalgam. I think it's put together from a series of different kinds of sources like this. See if you agree with me when we look at this piece. When we look at the heads, when you first look at it, you say, no, there's nothing going on there that's very similar at all. But look at this. Okay, so this is this. The facial figures, the features are the same, or similar, or related. When we move down the body and we look at, he's got a flower in his hand. Reverse image, mirror image, he's grasping onto his garment in the same way, and so on. So if you go for that, and I've done that, and other times I think you've all heard this one before, if you go for that in great detail, you find that there's a lot of similarities between some of these kinds of imagery. But it's never a direct translation. It's an interpretation, an understanding. And I think something important comes in along with that is that it's an interpretation. That there's an existing series of iconographies in China that are also being incorporated into this Buddhist sculpture. One of them is shown here. What is it? What does the circle and the square represent in Chinese art? Heaven and earth. So as you look at Han funerary practices, if you go out and look on the floor above, and you look at the tiles that we have from Han funerary sites, the circle in the form of a parasol and the square in the form of the carriage in which the body is being carried are very common parts of that iconography. The funerary iconography certainly of the Eastern Han and into the Three Kingdoms and Six Dynasties. It's also the square and the circle. That's what makes up a lot of what goes on in mirrors. So again, you have heaven and earth in mirrors, and that shows up quite early. That shows up as early as the Warring States. Almost all of these early Buddhist sculptures of this particular type have a square base and a circular umbrella. So again, they're incorporating, this is something that the Chinese are comfortable with. They understand the circle and the square as representing something that is religious, that has religious significance. So they're incorporating some of their own iconography, in iconography that also comes with the Buddhist tradition. So the umbrella is obviously part of the parasol, it's part of the Buddhist tradition. So they're finding things that they're comfortable with as well. So it isn't a simple direct transmission of, here's a gilt bronze sculpture, copy that. It's an interpretation, bringing in all the things that were going on in Central Asia, bringing in different kinds of media, be it paper, be it small sculptures or whatever, but also with local beliefs. So it gets to be a little bit, so when you look for a single source for the 3838 Buddha, I think you can look for multiple sources, but if you look for a single source, I think you're probably wasting your time. And if anybody does find that single source, let me know. I'd be very interested to see it. Does that make sense? So when we put the 338 Buddha up against the Gandharan sculpture that's of roughly the same period, they don't look that much alike. I mean, they look somewhat alike, and there's going to be a lot of the materials being translated from Gandhara is going in China at that time. But the traditions are quite different, and the interpretations that are going on in between the Gandharan kingdom and China, and the interpretations that are going on within China itself, make for something different, a different kind of a piece, a different kind of sculpture. So you're not going to see this really, this is a marvelous piece in the Asian Art Museum collection. They're different, clearly different. The iconography somehow got lost in translation, or there's something else going on there, a different iconography that's gotten built into it from other sources. I mean, these are the correct kind of mudras, probably for the sculpture of the type, and so on. There are things that get mixed up, things that get mistranslated, things that get mistransmitted, but I don't think you're going to find the direct source in Gandhara. I don't think you're going to go there. Okay, David, you should leave now because I'm going to go into all these histories and personalities. How much time do I have? About 25 minutes. I can do quite a bit. At the time that the 338 Buddha was created, you could look at the broader world that the Chinese might have known about we can divide it maybe into two kind of broad categories, or three broad categories. The settled aristocratic cultures that they were aware of. So that was China itself, the Kushan Empire, which ended somewhere in the 4th century. And then if you go further west, the Sasanian empires and such further out here. But those were really beyond the direct contact of the Chinese. The Chinese were going to be in touch with the Kushans here. There were the nomadic peoples, and the nomadic peoples had been an issue for the Chinese for a long, long time. And the biggest amongst those for much of China's early history were the Xiongnu. Now, I'm sorry to tell you that the Xiongnu were not a single entity. The Xiongnu called themselves the 100 Peoples. So amongst that already confusing groups of people that we know of up north, these various people, the Xiongnu, the Xianbei, and so on and so forth, these were actually tribal federations made up of many, many tribes. These were big federations, tribal federations, and the peoples that made up these federations spoke different languages, were different ethnic backgrounds, but for one way or another, a dominant clan would come forward and be able to hold them together. And the Xiongnu, at the earliest of their, and the greatest of their power, were able to bring together a fighting force of up to 300,000 men. So they were a very potent force upon the northern part of China. They divided into the northern Xiongnu and the southern Xiongnu. The southern Xiongnu were allowed to move into China proper, and that became a problem, a historical problem. But the Xiongnu were a major force, the major force in the northwestern China, really starting from pre-Qin times up until the end of the Han. The Xianbei tribes, these people were more to the northeast. And for those of you who are really interested, the Murong Xianbei were the northern Wei. They were the Toba. So they came out of this area up here. And at the end of the period that we're talking about, they became the power to be dealt with. During the period that we're talking about, they became the power to be dealt with. Amongst the Xiongnu, the people that were in the tribal federation of the Xiongnu were people called the Jie, J-I-E, or Lijie, L-I-J-I-E. For most of the period under consideration there, they were part of the confederacy, but they were also the rulers of a kingdom called the later Zhao, which existed from 319 to 350, and it was in the later Zhao that the 338 Buddha was created. And that's the date. The king of the later Zhao, a man named Shi Hu, is mentioned in that inscription, his title, and a cyclical date. And that's what gives us the date of 338. He's not Chinese, he's Jie. So the Jie, we know from the records of the time, had big noses and beards, like me. They were Indo-Iranian. So, but they were part of the Xiongnu Confederation. In 386, the Tuobao Wei of the Xianbei put an end to all of that kind of mess up north and united northern China and established the Northern Wei dynasty. So this whole thing comes to an end in 386. Of course, the other groups that the Chinese would have been in contact with were the merchants. We talked about those, the Sogdians somewhat, but also those local merchants and those kingdoms that settled themselves up along the multiple kingdoms that settled themselves up along the Silk Road. And then the monks and missionaries, those people who brought Buddhism to China, the active spreaders of the faith. So in the 3rd century, tens of thousands of Xiongnu were allowed to settle in Shanxi, so they were allowed to settle up here. Among them were the Jie, and again, they were descendants probably of the Tocharians or maybe the Sogdians. It's hard to know for sure. There's some argument about that. But they did have big noses and beards. And they have spoken Indo-Iranian language. At least one sentence about survives, and we'll meet the person who spoke that sentence in a minute or two. Between 302 and 303, Shanxi was struck by a famine, and the local governor decided to buy grain for his army by rounding up Jie and Xiongnu men and sending them to Hebei and Shandong to be sold as slaves. So they were going from here over to here. Selling of slaves was not uncommon at that time. Among them was a man named Shi Le, S-H-I-L-E. And he was sold as a slave over here into Shandong province. In 303, Shi Le's master restored his freedom, and he joined a bandit gang in Shandong province. So he was over there in Shandong, and he was a bandit. In 305, Shi Le became involved in a civil war then raging between the princes of the Jin imperial clan. So this is one of those states, the Chinese states, that was in the north with its capital at Luoyang. In the middle part of 307, the army Shi Le was involved with suffered a major defeat and fled. He fled back to Shanxi. He became a general under the Xiongnu rebel warlord named Liu Yuan. So Liu Yuan is a Xiongnu, and the Xiongnu, the southern Xiongnu, had supposedly one of the Chinese emperors had sent an imperial princess to be married to the Xiongnu king. So the Xiongnu king, the Xiongnu leader, said, well, we're descendants of the Han, so I'm going to take the imperial name Liu, and he established a Han dynasty. So there's a Han dynasty up there, just to make it more confusing at this time. There's a Han dynasty with the family name Liu. That's actually a Xiongnu dynasty. It's not a Chinese dynasty, it's a Xiongnu dynasty. Are we confused yet? We're just getting warmed up. Between 310 and 316, the Xiongnu, under this Liu Yuan and his Han dynasty, took most of North China, and the Jin government was forced to flee. In 310, that really horrible thing happened. Foreigners took Luoyang, they took the capital, and the Jin was forced to flee, and that's the beginning of the northern and southern dynasties. The Jin capital fled to Nanjing, and Nanjing was to be the capital of the southern dynasties, the Chinese dynasties from that point on. So 310 is a very significant year in Chinese history. So the Eastern Jin, then the Jin dynasty in the south, was from 317 to 420. In 311, Liu Yuan's forces took Luoyang, and Shi Le played a major role. So this is this guy again, this Jie, in the Xiongnu victory. And in the process, he established a personal power base in Hebei province. So he's out here. He's got his personal power base kind of out in this area out here. But these guys could never get along very long, so in 318, a palace coup took place, and the lives of the Xiongnu Han Emperor, the Xiongnu Han Emperor died. He was killed, and as was nearly the entire imperial clan. Shirla and a remaining Xiongnu aristocrat named Liu Yao, who was based at Chang'an, put down the coup and divided the empire between themselves. Now, to make it more fun, just to keep you happy, they both established a dynasty that was named Zhao. So just to keep it straight, the dynasty that was controlled by the member of the Liu family, the Xiongnu family, became former Zhao, and Shirla's dynasty was the later Zhao. So he's over there. So Shirla. This is just one tiny little bit of this fascinating period. It was really messy. So this is in 319. They both used the name Zhao as the name of their regimes. Historians then called Liu Yao as the former Zhao with his capital at Xi'an. Shirla's state was called the later Zhao with its capital in Hebei at a city called Ye. Ye is to be important throughout the Three Kingdoms and Six Dynasties period, and was the capital of the Northern Qi dynasty. So it was a major city that's kind of vanished into history. It's gone. Major city of that time, but have gone in, and now we don't know much about it, but it was marvelous things were made there. In between 324 and 325, the two Zhaos began to fight with each other. And between 328 and 329, former Zhao was completely destroyed by the later Zhao. And so later Zhao took over this area and then controlled most of what was known as northern China. Shirla died in 333. I wish he'd lasted 5 more years so I could actually tie him directly to the 338 Buddha, but he didn't. He died in 333. And the control of his state was taken by his nephew, Shi Hu, who was a bit of a violent individual, but he was also a very ardent practitioner of Buddhism. He established his capital at Ye in Hebei province. In 336, Shi Hu begins a series of building projects, and the Taiwu Palace is described in the annals of his time in this manner. The foundation was 9 1/3 meters tall. So what is that, about 30 meters tall? That's just for the foundations. 65 steps long and 75 steps wide. All were made of marble. The bottom contains a basement that's large enough for 500 armed guards. The gaps between the bricks were filled with paint. The tops of the buttresses were decorated with gold. The tops of the columns were decorated with silver. The screens were made of pearls and the walls were made of jade. The workmanship was extremely fine. The imperial bedroom has facilities including a bed made of white jade and comforters with fine ribbons, and on top of the comforters were sewn in lotus flowers made of gold. He also built a large number of Buddhist temples, and there must have been some amazing large Buddhist temples built at this time. So the foreign rulers of this northern area, they were taking over China. They were taking over a Chinese population. They couldn't easily claim the mandate of heaven because they weren't Chinese. So Buddhism was both for them a religion, but it was also pragmatic because there were a number of practitioners amongst the local population, and Buddhism was spreading. So they became ardent supporters of Buddhism, partly for practical reasons and partly for religious reasons. But they were major supporters of Buddhism, and certainly that was to continue to be the case throughout the Northern Wei and into the Tang. In 338, later Zhao was at its peak. In 349, Shi Hu died, and his state was taken over by his adopted son, who was given the name Shimin, the family name Shimin, who then took back his original family name, which was Ran. And we really know what the Jie looked like because he began a systematic genocide of the Jie. And they're described, anybody with a big nose and a beard is going to die because he killed them all. That was China's first major genocide. So this was in the year 349. And by 352, all of Hebei, in the northern part, the later Zhao was over with. So it was a very short-lived dynasty. Again, violence amongst these ruling families was altogether too common. And in 352, the Murong Xianbei took over, and then not so much long after that, they established the Northern Wei. This is a cute guy, right? This is a man that we can directly associate with the 338. And personally, I believe the 338 is a portrait of this guy. Don't quote me on that, though. This is Phua Tu Dong. Look at his dates. Anybody do the math on that? He was born in 231 and he died in 349. That's 118 years, last time I counted. He either lived to be a long time or there was something wrong with historical sources. But certainly he was born in Kucha, so that major site that we talked about earlier, this major site of Kucha. It's thought that one of his parents was Yuezhi, in Indian origin, and his other side was local. He studied Buddhism in Kashmir, so he went from Kucha, he went from Kucha to Kashmir, and this whole business of Kashmir, again, it's fascinating. That's where he studied Buddhism. Everybody was going to Kashmir to study Buddhism. He then likely spent time in Dunhuang, so he moved on down the Silk Road to Dunhuang, to the major center in Dunhuang, which was a major center from the Eastern Han on, of Buddhist sites, Buddhist studies and Buddhist translation and so on. In 310, he made his way to Luoyang. So how many of you have been listening? What happened in 310 in Luoyang? That's when the Xiongnu started taking Luoyang. By 311, Luoyang, the capital, was gone. He arrived at a bad time, or a good time, depending on how you look at it, because he arrived and he kind of hooked up with this guy named Shi Le and became one of his advisors and actually got him to become a Buddhist. So in 311, when Luoyang falls to the Xiongnu troop, that's when he was there. Phua Tu Dong was there, and he converted Shi Le to Buddhism and became one of his most trusted advisors. Phua Tu Dong uttered the only phrase that has reached us in modern times in the Jie language, cited in connection with Shi Le's fight against Liu Yao in 328, and recorded in the Chinese annals with Chinese translation. So we actually have a little idea of what that language sounded like because of Phua Tu Dong. In 333, he became a later Zhao, a government official under Shu Hu, who allowed him to found a great number of Buddhist temples. So he was the one who founded the Buddhist temples. Phua Tu Dong was credited with great powers in his biography, in the biographies of the eminent monks written in the 6th century. And here are some examples. When he took sesame seed oil, mixed it with rouge, and smeared it on his palm, events more than 1,000 li away could be revealed in that palm. He could also make Buddhists see these events on his palm. So not only could he interpret them, but anybody who was Buddhist could interpret them. When he heard the sound of bells, he would foretell events based on them, and his prophecies were always fulfilled. He could foretell the outcome of any major battle, so therefore he was very popular, and also predict any impeding enemy attacks. So Shi Le liked him a lot. He made a dry stream flow again by summoning a dragon and chanting and incense burning. He could interpret omens correctly. On the left side of Phua Tu Dong's breast in front, there was a hole 4 or 5 inches round. It connected with the insides of his abdomen. Sometimes his intestines came out from inside, and sometimes he stopped the hole up with silk waste. If in the night he wanted to read a book, he always removed the silk waste, and then the whole room was lit up. How about that? Moreover, on fast days, he always went to the bank of a stream, took out his intestines, and washed them and put them back inside. He was 117 years old when he died in the year 348. When he died, he was buried with his staff and alms bowl. Later, Ranmin, the Shimin Ranmin, who overthrew the later Zhao, opened the coffin and found only the staff and bowl. He didn't find the corpse was completely gone. So he was not a great translator. He did not translate any Buddhist texts. None of the Buddhist texts were associated with him. He was a great propagator. He was a missionary. He was there and he brought the faith and he got people to convert. He had the right personality, the right set of skills. There's a lot of discussion in the Buddhist community Buddhist scholars community about what were his magical powers, where were they based, what were they really? But he brought Buddhism and made it popular in China. He established it in the capital. He got the ruling family to become Buddhist. He spread it, and his disciples spread it all over. And then among his important disciples were Dao An, Zhu Faya, Zhu Fa Tai, etc., etc., etc. When the later Zhao collapsed, they spread throughout China. One went to Shandong, probably into Korea. One went to Guangdong, all the way down the far south. One went to Sichuan. They were all over. They spread Buddhism all over China. So they were amongst the great propagators of Buddhism, the spreader of Buddhism in China. So his legacy is much longer and much more impactful than Shurla or the rulers of the later Zhao dynasty. In all the sites that he went, you find Buddhas of this type, this meditating Buddha. Therefore, I think this is his portrait, right? All right, thank you all very much. We have some time for questions.